Summer 1241. The Carpathian Basin lies open. From the eastern horizon, dust rises in columns that darken the sky for miles. Beneath that dust, an army moves, not marching, but flowing across the landscape like floodwater, finding every gap in the earth. They are Mongols, and they have already destroyed everything in their path. Karakorum to the Dnieper, the steppe empires to the forests of Rus, all have fallen. Now they cross into Hungary, and no force in Europe has stopped them. King Bela IV watches from the walls of Pest as smoke rises from villages along the Danube. His scouts bring reports that sound impossible. 40,000 horsemen, maybe more, moving in coordinated columns across a front hundreds of miles wide. They do not siege, they do not pause, they encircle, they burn, they vanish, and then they appear again where no army should be. At Mohi on the Sajau River, Bela masses his knights and infantry. The feudal levy of Hungary, perhaps 60,000 strong. The Mongols faint, withdraw, and then at dawn they strike from three sides at once. By noon, the Hungarian army ceases to exist. Tens of thousands die in the river or cut down in the rout. Bela himself barely escapes. This is not a single defeat. This is the collapse of a military system. The Mongols have refined war into something Europe has never encountered. Their composite bows outrange anything the West can field. Their horses are bred for endurance, not the short charges of heavy cavalry. They communicate across vast distances with signal arrows and relay riders. They do not need supply trains. They carry dried meat and fermented milk, and their horses graze as they move. When they encounter a fortified position, they bypass it or starve it out. When they meet an army in open battle, they do not fight. They maneuver, they harass, they fragment the enemy formation, and only then do they close in for the kill. Subutai commits a portion of his force to a siege, but the city holds. Weeks pass. The Mongols bring up siege engines, catapults and rams scavenged from earlier conquests or built on site by captured engineers. The walls crack but do not break. Sorties from the garrison disrupt the siege works. Supplies inside the city hold, and critically, the Mongol force tied down outside Esztergom is a force that cannot be maneuvering elsewhere. This is the friction point. The Mongol military system is built on mobility and speed. They win by never giving the enemy time to concentrate, by striking before defences can be organised, by moving faster than news of their approach. A siege is the opposite of this. A siege is static. It consumes men, time and supplies. It pins down forces that should be ranging across the countryside. And in the winter of 1241, the Mongols find themselves besieging not just Esztergom, but a scattering of fortified towns across Hungary and Croatia that refuse to yield. Székesfehérvár holds. Trogir on the Dalmatian coast holds. Even smaller fortresses, stone keeps on hilltops, walled monasteries, riverside citadels, become obstacles that slow the Mongol advance to a crawl. Subutai is not an amateur. He understands the problem. He has dealt with fortifications before, from the walled cities of Khwarezm to the fortresses of Rus. But those campaigns had time. The Mongol strategy in Central Asia and the steppes involved isolating cities, starving them into submission, and moving on while a skeleton force maintained the blockade. In Europe, that calculation changes. The cities are more numerous, the distances between them are shorter. The political fragmentation means that each fortress is independently held, and there is no central authority to negotiate surrender. And most critically, winter is ending. By March 1242, the Mongols are still in Hungary, still besieging cities that have not fallen, and reports begin filtering back to Subutai that change everything. The great Khan Ogadai is dead. He died in December, back in Karakorum, but the news has taken months to reach the field armies in Europe. Under Mongol law, the death of a Khan requires all princes of the blood to return to the capital for the Kurultai, the assembly that will elect the next Khan. Batu, the commander of the entire western campaign and grandson of Genghis himself, is required to attend. Subutai is his subordinate. The campaign must end. There is debate among historians about whether the Mongols would have continued into Western Europe if Ogadai had lived. The evidence suggests they were already encountering logistical strain, but the death of the Khan provides the strategic excuse to withdraw. In the spring of 1242, the Mongol armies pull back from Hungary, recross the Carpathians, and begin the long march east. They leave devastation behind, cities burned, populations decimated, entire regions depopulated. But they also leave something else, proof that stone walls can stop them. This is the thread that runs through the next century of European military development, and it begins not with a grand strategy, but with a desperate scramble to survive. The Mongol invasion of 1241 terrifies Europe in a way that no external threat has since the fall of Rome. Chronicles describe them as a scourge, a punishment from God, an army that cannot be defeated by mortal means. But underneath the apocalyptic language, commanders and rulers are drawing a very practical lesson. Open battle is suicide. Mobile defense is impossible. The only thing that works is stone. Think about what this means in concrete terms. A fortified city is not just a refuge. It is a logistics base, a command centre, a supply depot, and a trap for attackers. If the walls are strong enough and the garrison is provisioned, a single fortified position can tie down an army 10 times its size. The attackers must commit forces to the siege or risk leaving a hostile stronghold in their rear. They must bring up heavy equipment or starve the defenders out, both of which take time. And time is the one resource a mobile raiding force cannot afford to waste. The Mongols proved this themselves. They could shatter field armies in a single afternoon, but a stone fortress could delay them for months. The problem is that in 1241, Europe does not have enough fortresses. The ones that exist are relics of earlier eras or recent constructions by local lords, built more for prestige and controlling the peasantry than for withstanding a sustained siege by a professional army. Many are wooden palisades or earthwork mottes. Many have inadequate supplies or small garrisons. Many are isolated with no mutual support or coordinated defence. The Mongols bypassed most of them, and the ones they chose to besiege fell eventually. But the cities that held, Esztergom, Trogir, a handful of others, survived because they had stone walls, provisioned storerooms, and defenders willing to endure, and so the lesson spreads, not through royal decree but through raw survival instinct. Across Central Europe in the decades following 1242 something shifts. It happens quietly at first, without fanfare or proclamation. Lords who survived the Mongol invasion return to their lands and begin rebuilding, but they do not rebuild what was there before. They build stone. Small timber fortresses are replaced with stone keeps. Town walls that were wooden palisades are torn down and reconstructed in mortared stone, sometimes 10 feet thick. Watchtowers go up along trade routes and river crossings. Castles proliferate on hilltops and strategic passes. This is not a coordinated program. There is no central authority directing it. But the memory of 1241 burns into the collective consciousness of every ruler and military commander from Poland to Austria. The Mongols could return, and if they do, survival depends on walls. The scale of this construction effort is staggering. In Hungary alone, King Bela IV, the same king who fled the disaster at Mohi, authorises the building of dozens of new fortifications in the 1240s and 1250s. He grants privileges to towns that agree to wall themselves in stone. He finances the construction of royal castles at key river crossings and mountain passes. The nobility follows suit, not out of loyalty but out of self-preservation. A baron without a fortified seat is a baron who will lose everything when the next invasion comes. Stone becomes the currency of survival. But building walls is only part of the equation. The other part is understanding how to use them. A fortress is useless if the garrison abandons it at the first sign of trouble, or if the supplies run out after 2 weeks, or if there is no plan for mutual support between neighbouring strongholds. The military culture of medieval Europe begins to adapt slowly to the reality that defence is no longer about glorious cavalry charges in open fields. It's about endurance, logistics, and forcing the enemy to waste time. This is where the structural factor becomes visible. What the Mongols encountered in 1241 was a Europe that had spent centuries optimizing for a different kind of warfare. Small-scale feudal conflicts, sieges of wooden forts, and short campaigns decided by a single pitched battle. The fortifications that did exist were often symbolic, built to dominate the local peasantry or project lordly power, not to withstand a systematic siege by an enemy with siege engines and professional engineers. The Mongol invasion exposed this weakness with brutal efficiency, but it also revealed the solution, because the few fortresses that did hold demonstrated that stone walls, proper provisioning, and disciplined garrisons could stop even the most mobile and lethal army in the world. By the 1260s, the fortified landscape of Central Europe looks fundamentally different than it did in 1240. The density of stone fortifications has increased dramatically. Towns that were open settlements are now enclosed by walls with gates, towers, and bastions. Castles are no longer just residences. They are military installations designed to control territory and provide refuge during invasion. And crucially, the knowledge of how to defend these positions is spreading. Garrison commanders study siege warfare, engineers are brought in from Italy and the Crusader states, where the art of fortification is more advanced. Supplies are stockpiled: grain, salted meat, water cisterns, weapons, ammunition for crossbows, and later for early gunpowder weapons. The Mongols do not return to Central Europe in force. There are raids, border skirmishes, and threats, but the massive coordinated invasions of 1241 do not repeat. Part of this is internal Mongol politics, succession struggles, the division of the empire, shifting strategic priorities toward China and the Middle East. But part of it is calculation. The Mongol command structure is ruthlessly pragmatic. They do not waste resources on campaigns that offer diminishing returns, and the fortified depth of post-1241 Europe presents exactly that problem. To conquer Hungary or Poland now would require not a lightning campaign of maneuver and decisive battles, but a grinding war of sieges, each one consuming months and tying down forces that could be deployed elsewhere. The cost-benefit ratio has shifted. This is the practical structural factor that changes everything. It is not a weapon, it is not a tactic, it is infrastructure. Stone walls, provisioned fortresses, and a strategic culture that understands how to use them. The Mongols built an empire by exploiting mobility and speed. They defeated armies that could not concentrate fast enough, could not sustain themselves in the field, and could not force the Mongols to fight on unfavourable terms. But fortifications negate all of those advantages. They force the attacker to commit to static warfare. They consume time, the one resource that a mobile steppe army operating at the end of extended supply lines cannot afford to waste. They turn every town and castle into a potential trap, and the lesson spreads beyond Central Europe. In the decades following the Mongol withdrawal, rulers across the continent absorbed the implications. England, France, the Italian city-states, the Spanish kingdoms, all of them invest in fortifications, not because they fear the Mongols specifically, but because the principle is universal. A fortified position defended by a determined garrison can stop an army many times its size. This becomes the foundation of late medieval military strategy. Campaigns are no longer decided by a single climactic battle. They are wars of attrition, where the side that controls more fortified positions has better logistics and can sustain longer sieges wins. But there is a deeper consequence, one that reshapes the entire trajectory of European warfare. The proliferation of stone fortifications creates a new military reality. By the late 13th century, Europe is covered in castles and walled towns to a degree unprecedented in history. France alone has thousands of fortified sites. The Holy Roman Empire is a patchwork of castle-dominated territories. Italy's city-states are enclosed in walls so thick that besieging them becomes a multi-year endeavour. This does more than just defend against external invasion. It transforms the internal dynamics of power. A baron with a stone castle on a hilltop can defy a king. A walled city can resist an army until the besiegers run out of money or patience. Warfare becomes slower, more expensive, and more dependent on logistics than on battlefield prowess. This is the paradox. The same fortifications that saved Europe from the Mongols also make Europe nearly impossible to conquer from within. Kings trying to centralize authority find themselves bogged down in endless sieges of rebel castles. Wars between rival lords drag on for years because neither side can force a decisive engagement. The heavy cavalry charge, already declining in effectiveness against disciplined infantry and fortified positions, becomes even less relevant. What matters now is who can afford to maintain a siege train, who can starve out a garrison, who can breach walls with increasingly sophisticated artillery, and that artillery is coming. The Mongols themselves used gunpowder weapons, primitive rockets and bombs acquired from Chinese engineers. By the 14th century, European craftsmen are experimenting with cannon. Early versions are crude, iron or bronze tubes that fire stone balls with uncertain accuracy and frequent misfires. But the principle is sound. A gunpowder weapon can crack stone in ways that a trebuchet or battering ram cannot. The first castle walls to fall to cannon fire crumble in the 1320s and 1330s. By the Hundred Years' War, artillery is standard equipment in any siege, but even as cannon develop, fortifications adapt. Walls become thicker and lower to resist bombardment. Bastions are angled to deflect projectiles. Star forts emerge in the 15th and 16th centuries, designed specifically to counter artillery. The race between fortification and siege technology becomes an arms race that defines European warfare for the next 300 years. And at the root of this entire evolution is the lesson learned in 1241. Mobility alone is not enough. An army that cannot take fortified positions cannot hold territory. The Mongols understood this. Subutai was one of the greatest generals in history, a man who commanded campaigns across thousands of miles and coordinated armies separated by weeks of travel. He won battles through superior intelligence, logistics, and maneuver. But in Hungary, in the winter of 1241, he encountered the one thing his system could not efficiently counter: a network of stone fortresses held by garrisons that refused to surrender. He could bypass them, and he did. But bypassing fortifications only works if your goal is raiding. If your goal is conquest, if you need to occupy and control territory, then every bypassed fortress becomes a base for resistance, a supply depot for enemy forces, a rallying point for counterattacks. The Mongol withdrawal in 1242 is often attributed solely to the death of Ögedei, and that certainly triggered the decision. But the deeper reason is visible in the strategic picture. The Mongols had pushed as far west as their logistics and operational tempo could sustain. They had defeated every field army that opposed them, but they had not pacified the territory. Fortresses still held out. Populations had fled into walled cities or mountain refuges. The countryside was devastated, but devastation is not the same as control. To actually hold Hungary, Poland, and the Balkans would require garrisoning those fortresses, either by taking them through siege or by building new ones. That kind of occupation requires a different kind of military organisation, one built on static garrisons, supply depots, and administrative infrastructure. The Mongol system, optimised for mobility and conquest, is not designed for that. This is the structural mismatch. The Mongols perfected a form of warfare that could shatter centralised empires with rigid command structures and slow-moving armies. They could defeat the Khwarezmian Empire because once the major cities fell, the empire collapsed. They could conquer Rus because the principalities were fragmented and unable to coordinate. But Europe in 1241, for all its political fragmentation, had something the steppe empires lacked: a decentralised network of fortified strongholds, each one independently held, each one requiring individual reduction. There was no single capital to capture, no central authority whose defeat would end the war. Every castle, every walled town was a separate campaign, and the Mongols chose not to fight that campaign. They withdrew, and Europe survived. Not because of military genius, not because of a miracle, but because the defensive infrastructure, however incomplete and improvised in 1241, was just robust enough to impose unacceptable costs on the invaders. And in the decades that followed, that infrastructure became immeasurably stronger. By 1260, if the Mongols had returned in the same force, the campaign in Hungary reveals this dynamic with brutal clarity. After the destruction of the Hungarian field army at Moe in April 1241, the Mongols have the run of the kingdom. King Bela is in flight. The nobility is shattered. There is no organised resistance in the field. For a mobile army, this should be the moment of total victory. The Mongols split into columns and sweep across the Hungarian plain, burning, looting, driving populations before them. Chroniclers describe the devastation in apocalyptic terms: villages emptied, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered or driven off. Refugees pour into whatever fortified positions they can reach. Some flee across the border into Austria or Croatia. Others barricade themselves in monasteries, hilltop castles, anywhere with walls. And here the Mongol advance slows, not because they are defeated, but because the targets that remain are all fortified. Buda, across the river from Pest, holds out behind its walls. Esztergom, as mentioned, ties down a significant Mongol force for months. Szekesfehérvár, the ancient coronation city of Hungarian kings, withstands repeated assaults. On the Adriatic coast, the city of Trogir refuses to open its gates even as Mongol detachments probe the Dalmatian littoral. In Croatia, fortresses on rocky outcrops and islands become refuges for the local population. The Mongols storm some of them, bypass others, but each one consumes time and effort. Subutai is too experienced to waste his entire force on reducing these positions. He knows the strategic clock is running. Winter is coming, and even though his forces are capable of winter operations, the deeper into the cold season they go, the harder it becomes to sustain the horses and maintain operational mobility. He needs to complete the conquest, establish control, and prepare for the next phase, whether that is consolidating Hungary as a base for further westward expansion or turning south into the Balkans. But consolidation requires occupation, and occupation requires controlling the fortified centres. The Mongols cannot do this without committing to sieges, and large-scale sieges are exactly what their operational doctrine is designed to avoid. So Subutai makes a calculated decision. He divides his forces. Some columns continue raiding westward into Austria and northward into Poland, probing for weaknesses and gathering intelligence. Other columns maintain loose blockades of the major fortified cities, preventing resupply and harassing any relief attempts. But he does not commit his full strength to breaching the walls. He waits, he applies pressure, he lets hunger and despair do the work. This is sound strategy if you have unlimited time, but time is the one thing Subutai does not have. By December 1241, the situation is stalemated. The Mongols control the countryside, but the fortified centres remain defiant. And then the news arrives. Ögedei Khan is dead. The implications ripple through the Mongol command structure immediately. Batu, the supreme commander of the European campaign, is a prince of the blood and a potential claimant to the Khanate. His presence at the Kurultai is not optional. Subutai, loyal to Batu, prepares for withdrawal. There is no sudden collapse, no panicked retreat. The Mongols pull back in good order, taking their plunder, their captives, and their herds. By spring 1242, they're gone from Hungary, recrossing the Carpathians and disappearing back into the steppes from which they came. The cities that held out survive. The populations that sheltered behind stone walls emerge to find a landscape utterly transformed. Depopulated, burned, but not occupied. The Mongols did not leave garrisons. They did not install puppet rulers. They did not establish administrative control. They raided, they destroyed, and they left. This is the crucial distinction. A raiding campaign, no matter how destructive, is not the same as conquest. Conquest requires the ability to impose lasting control, and that requires infrastructure. The Mongols chose not to build that infrastructure in Europe, partly because of Ögedei's death, but partly because the cost of doing so, measured in time, in forces tied down to sieges, in the shift from mobile to static operations, was too high. Europe absorbs the lesson, and the response accelerates. In the 1250s and 1260s, construction of stone fortifications reaches a fever pitch. But this is not just about building more castles, it is about building a system. Fortresses are placed to support each other, close enough that relief forces from one can reach another within a day or two of hard marching. River crossings are fortified. Mountain passes are blocked by castles that command the approaches. Supply depots are established in walled towns. Garrison rotations are organised so that defenders can be relieved before morale collapses. The military culture shifts from one that valorises the single glorious charge to one that understands the grinding, unglamorous work of holding fortified ground. This transformation is visible in the architectural record. Castles built after 1241 are different from those built before. They are larger, with thicker walls and more sophisticated defensive features. Towers are designed to provide overlapping fields of fire. Gatehouses become killing zones with murder holes and multiple portcullises. Water sources are secured within the walls. Storage facilities are expanded to hold supplies for months, not weeks. These are not just defensive improvements, they are the physical manifestation of a strategic doctrine. Make every fortified position costly enough to besiege that an attacker must think twice before committing to the siege. And the doctrine works. When the Mongols raid into Poland again in 1259 and 1287, they encounter a fortified landscape far more developed than the one they faced in 1241. They win skirmishes, burn villages, take captives, but they do not achieve the kind of sweeping conquest that characterized the first invasion. The Polish and Hungarian kingdoms survive, the fortifications hold, and over time, the Mongol threat recedes as internal politics and new strategic priorities pull their attention elsewhere. But the infrastructure remains, and it reshapes everything. The next century of European warfare is a testament to the power of fortified defence. The 100 Years' War, as already mentioned, grinds through France and England with siege after siege. But there are other conflicts, smaller in scope but equally revealing. The Italian city-states wage wars that are almost entirely about controlling fortified towns. Milan, Venice, Florence, each commands a network of walled cities and castles that provide strategic depth. Battles are rare, sieges are constant. The condottieri, the mercenary captains who dominate Italian warfare in the 14th and 15th centuries, are experts not in pitched battle, but in manoeuvre, blockade, and the careful calculus of when to assault a fortification and when to starve it out. In the Holy Roman Empire, the situation is even more fragmented. Hundreds of semi-independent princes, bishops, and free cities each control their own territories, each defended by castles and town walls. Imperial campaigns to enforce central authority collapse into endless sieges of rebel strongholds. The emperor cannot compel obedience because he cannot take every castle. The princes cannot expand their territories because their neighbours are equally well fortified. The result is a strategic stalemate that persists for generations, broken only by occasional large-scale conflicts or the introduction of new military technologies. Gunpowder artillery begins to shift the balance in the 15th century, but not as quickly as often assumed. Early cannon are cumbersome, expensive, and unreliable. They require skilled gunners, large quantities of powder, and careful maintenance. A fortress wall can be breached, but it takes days of sustained bombardment, and if the defenders have their own guns or are willing to sally out and destroy the siege engines, the advantage can swing back. The real impact of artillery is not that it makes fortifications obsolete, but that it raises the cost of fortification. Walls must now be built thicker, lower, and with angled bastions to resist cannon fire. The expense of constructing and maintaining such defences becomes a significant burden on even wealthy cities and kingdoms, but the investment continues, because the alternative is unacceptable. A ruler without fortifications is a ruler at the mercy of any army that appears on his border. This is the lesson driven home by the Mongol invasions and reinforced by every subsequent conflict. Fortifications are not a luxury. They are the foundation of territorial integrity. And so the construction continues, even as the technology evolves. Trace Italian fortifications, the star-shaped forts designed to resist artillery, begin appearing in Italy in the late 15th century and spread across Europe over the next 100 years. These are enormously expensive, requiring years to build and constant maintenance, but they work. A well-designed star fort can hold off an army for months, even against sustained artillery bombardment. The strategic lesson that began with the Mongol withdrawal in 1242 thus becomes embedded in the military architecture of early modern Europe. Control of fortified positions is control of territory. An army can march wherever it wants, but if it cannot take and hold fortresses, it cannot impose lasting political change. This principle holds true through the wars of the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the wars of Louis XIV, and even into the era of Napoleon. Fortresses continue to play a decisive role in European warfare well into the 19th century. But the deeper lesson is about the nature of military power itself. The Mongols demonstrated that tactical and operational superiority can win battles and devastate entire regions. But tactical brilliance without the ability to consolidate control is ultimately limited. The Mongols could destroy European field armies with ease. They could ravage the countryside and terrorize populations. But they could not hold Europe because they could not efficiently reduce the network of fortifications that medieval society had begun to build, and that the trauma of 1241 accelerated into a comprehensive defensive system. This is not to romanticize medieval fortifications or suggest they were invincible. They were not. Castles fell all the time, to siege, to starvation, to treachery, to bombardment. But the key word is time. A fortress imposed a time cost on the attacker. And in pre-modern warfare, time was often the decisive factor. Armies could not stay in the field indefinitely. Supplies ran out, soldiers deserted, disease set in, the weather turned, political situations shifted. Every week spent besieging a castle was a week the attacker's strategic position could deteriorate. The defender only had to hold out long enough for relief to arrive, or for the attacker to give up, or for winter to force a withdrawal. The Mongols understood this calculus better than most. Subutai had conducted campaigns across Asia that involved coordinating multiple armies over thousands of miles and timing operations to seasonal weather patterns. He knew how to manage logistics, how to sustain operational tempo, how to exploit enemy weaknesses. But in Hungary in 1241, he encountered a situation where the tactical victories his forces won in the field did not translate into strategic control of the territory. The fortified cities held out, The relief forces never materialized. There were no relief forces, the Hungarian military had been annihilated, but the fortifications themselves provided enough resistance to make occupation prohibitively costly. And so the Mongols withdrew, not defeated in battle, not driven out by a counter-offensive, but forced to make a strategic calculation that further westward expansion into a landscape increasingly thick with fortifications was not worth the cost. Ögedei's death provided the immediate trigger, but the underlying structural reality was already in place. The Mongol military system, optimized for mobility and decisive battle, could not efficiently conquer a region defended by dispersed, independently held stone fortifications without fundamentally changing the nature of that system, and such a change would have negated the very advantages that made the Mongol army so formidable in the first place. This is the paradox at the heart of pre-modern military power. Mobility wins battles. The century following the Mongol withdrawal sees Europe grapple with the implications of this paradox. Kings and commanders who understand the power of fortifications begin to think systematically about defensive networks, not just individual castles. Edward I of England, conquering Wales in the 1280s, does not simply defeat the Welsh in battle. He builds a ring of massive stone fortresses, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris, each positioned to dominate key routes and coastal access points, each supplied by sea, each capable of holding out even if surrounded. The Welsh resistance collapses not because they lose battles, but because they cannot retake these fortresses, and without controlling them, they cannot expel the English presence. Edward understands that conquest is not about destroying enemy armies, it is about establishing permanent control through fortified strongpoints that the enemy cannot reduce. The same logic appears in the Crusader states. The Kingdom of Jerusalem and its successor states survive for 2 centuries in hostile territory, largely because of their fortifications. Crac des Chevaliers, Margat, Belvoir, these are not just castles, they are fortified bases that control entire regions. Muslim armies can raid past them, but they cannot eliminate the Crusader presence without taking these fortresses. And taking them requires sieges that consume time and resources. When Saladin reconquers much of the Levant after his victory at Hattin in 1187, he does not win primarily through battlefield prowess. He wins by systematically reducing Crusader fortifications one after another, using siege engines, starvation, and negotiated surrender. Even then, the process takes years, and some fortresses hold out long enough to be reinforced or relieved. The Teutonic Knights in the Baltic follow a similar model. Their conquest of Prussia in the 13th century is built around a network of brick and stone castles that serve as both military bases and administrative centres. The native Prussian tribes are fierce fighters, but they lack fortifications and cannot dislodge the Teutonic Order from their strongholds. The knights expand methodically, building new castles as they advance, each one serving as a base for further operations and a refuge if the tide turns. The system works because it is cumulative. Each fortress is a permanent gain, difficult to reverse even if the field forces suffer a setback. This is the grounded strategic lesson that medieval Europe learns through hard experience. Territorial control requires infrastructure, and the most important infrastructure is defensive. An army is a temporary concentration of force. It exists for a campaign season and then disperses. A fortress is permanent. It holds ground year-round. It projects power continuously, and most critically, it forces the enemy to either invest resources in reducing it or accept that the territory it commands remains contested. The Mongol invasions exposed the weakness of a military system built on temporary levies and mobile field armies without sufficient fortified depth. The response was not a single grand strategy, but a fusion of knowledge and practice across hundreds of independent political entities, each one learning the same lesson and applying it within their own territories. The cumulative effect was a transformation of the European strategic landscape into one of the most heavily fortified regions in world history. By 1300, travelling through much of Central and Western Europe meant encountering a fortified town or castle every few miles. Major routes were dominated by strongpoints. Rivers and mountain passes were controlled by garrisons. The density of fortifications made large-scale conquest or raiding prohibitively expensive in time and resources. This does not mean warfare stopped. It means warfare changed. Battles still occurred, but their results were less decisive. A defeated army could retreat into fortifications and rebuild. a victorious army still had to reduce enemy strongholds to consolidate gains. The rhythm of warfare shifted from rapid campaigns to slow, grinding struggles punctuated by occasional pitched battles. This is frustrating for commanders trained in the heroic ideal of decisive battlefield victory, but it is the reality imposed by the strategic environment. The fortifications dictate the pace. The Mongols never adapted to this environment because they never needed to. Their empire spanned the steppe and the regions where fortified cities were isolated nodes, not continuous networks. In China, they besieged and took walled cities, but Chinese cities were centralized administrative and economic hubs whose fall often led to the collapse of regional resistance. In Persia and the Middle East, the same pattern held, but in Europe there was no centralized structure to collapse. Every castle was an independent problem. Every walled town required its own solution. The effort required to conquer and hold such territory would have transformed the Mongol military system into something unrecognizable, something slow and static and expensive, and so they chose not to. By the late 13th century, the Mongol threat to Europe fades. The Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state that controls the western steppes, becomes entangled in its own internal politics and conflicts with other Mongol khanates. Raids into Poland and Hungary continue sporadically, but they are raids, not invasions. The frontier stabilizes, and Europe, fortified and wary, consolidates behind its walls. But the memory remains. Chronicles and histories of the Mongol invasions are copied and recopied throughout the medieval period. The terror of 1241 becomes a reference point, a reminder of how close Europe came to conquest, and how survival depended not on battlefield heroics, but on the unglamorous work of building and holding fortified positions. This memory shapes military culture. It validates the enormous expense of stone fortifications. It justifies the slow, grinding strategies that dominate later medieval warfare, and it teaches a lesson that transcends the specific context of the Mongol threat. That lesson is this: an enemy can be tactically superior, operationally brilliant, and logistically efficient, and still fail to achieve strategic objectives if the defender can impose costs that exceed the attacker's tolerance. Those costs can be measured in casualties, in time, in resources, or in political capital, but the mechanism is the same. The defender does not need to win in the traditional sense. The defender needs to make winning too expensive. This principle reverberates through the centuries that follow. The Swiss pikemen who dominate European battlefields in the 14th and 15th centuries are often celebrated for their tactical prowess and discipline, but their strategic independence rests on the fortified mountain passes and towns of the Alpine cantons. Habsburg armies can defeat Swiss forces in the field, and sometimes do, but they cannot hold Swiss territory because they cannot reduce the network of fortified positions that control the mountain valleys. The Swiss do not need to win every battle. They need to make conquest unaffordable, and the geography combined with fortifications accomplishes exactly that. The Dutch revolt against Spain in the late 16th century follows a similar logic. Spanish tercios are the most formidable infantry in Europe, professional soldiers capable of defeating much larger forces through discipline and firepower. They win battle after battle in the Low Countries. But the Dutch hold their fortified cities, Amsterdam, Leiden, Haarlem, Alkmaar, and the Spanish exhaust themselves in sieges that drag on for months. Haarlem holds out for 7 months, in 1572 and 1573 before finally falling. Leiden endures a siege in 1574 and is relieved only when the Dutch cut the dikes and flood the surrounding countryside, forcing the Spanish to withdraw. Alkmaar withstands an 8-week siege and repels the Spanish entirely. Each siege consumes Spanish resources, erodes Spanish morale, and buys the Dutch time to reorganize and resupply. The Spanish Empire at its height can field armies anywhere in Europe, supported by the wealth of the New World and a sophisticated logistical network. But even Spain cannot afford to besiege every fortified Dutch city while simultaneously fighting wars in Italy, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic. The Dutch do not defeat Spain militarily in any conventional sense. They outlast Spain by making the war too expensive to continue. By 1609, Spain agrees to a truce recognizing Dutch independence, not because the Spanish army has been destroyed, but because the cost of continuing the war outweighs the benefits. The fortified cities of the Netherlands impose that cost. This is not an obscure or isolated phenomenon. It is the central dynamic of European warfare from the 13th century onward. Fortifications do not guarantee survival, but they fundamentally alter the strategic calculus. They force attackers to commit time and resources to sieges. They provide defenders with strongpoints from which to launch counterattacks. They create strategic depth that allows a smaller or weaker power to resist a stronger one. The Mongols in 1241 were the first to encounter this dynamic at scale in Europe, and their withdrawal set the precedent. But there is one more layer to the story, one that brings the lesson full circle. Because the weapon that medieval armies could not counter was not just the Mongol composite bow or their cavalry mobility, it was the Mongol ability to operate inside the European decision cycle, to move faster and strike harder than any defensive response could match. The fortifications countered this by removing speed from the equation. A fortress does not react, it simply exists. It cannot be outmaneuvered, it cannot be caught off guard. It sits astride a route or commands a region and forces the attacker to deal with it on the defender's timeline, not the attacker's. This temporal dimension is crucial. Pre-modern armies operate on rhythms dictated by weather, harvest cycles, and the endurance of men and animals. A feudal levy can stay in the field for 40 days, maybe 60 if the king can pay them. After that, the soldiers go home to tend their farms. A besieging army can maintain a blockade as long as its supplies last, but those supplies must come from somewhere, and the longer the siege drags on, the more vulnerable the supply lines become to raids and interdiction. A garrison inside a fortress, by contrast, can endure for as long as the food and water hold out, and if properly provisioned, that can be months or even years. The defenders of Esztergom in the winter of 1241 did not defeat the Mongols who besieged them. They simply held out until the Mongols moved on. The defenders of Trogir perched on an island in the Adriatic. This brings us to the culmination of the lesson. The weapon that medieval armies could not counter was the Mongol operational system: mobility, coordination, and the ability to destroy field armies before they could concentrate. But the counter to that weapon was not another weapon. It was a shift in the entire strategic framework. By building fortifications and learning to defend them, Europe changed the nature of warfare from decisive battles to wars of attrition. The Mongols could not adapt to that framework without abandoning the very characteristics that made them formidable, and so they withdrew, and Europe survived. But the deeper lesson applies to any military system. Tactical superiority is not enough. Operational brilliance is not enough. If you cannot translate battlefield success into lasting control, if you cannot impose costs on the enemy that they are unwilling to pay, if you cannot sustain your operations long enough to break the enemy's will and capacity to resist, then strategic victory remains elusive. The Mongols won every battle they fought in Hungary. They shattered the Hungarian army, terrorized the population, and ravaged the countryside. But they did not conquer Hungary because conquest requires more than destruction. It requires occupation, administration, and the ability to suppress resistance over time. And that, in turn, requires either the cooperation of the local population or the infrastructure to control them by force. The Mongols had neither, and the fortifications made acquiring either prohibitively expensive. This is not a story about European exceptionalism or inherent superiority. The Mongols conquered vast territories in Asia and the Middle East using the same military system that operated in Europe. The difference was structural. In China, Persia, and Central Asia, cities were nodes in centralized empires. Taking the capital or the major urban centers often led to the collapse of organized resistance. In Europe, there was no capital to take. There were hundreds of semi-independent fortified positions, each one requiring individual reduction. The cost-benefit ratio was different, and the Mongols made a rational decision not to pay that cost. Europe, for its part, did not consciously design a defensive system to counter the Mongol threat. The fortifications that saved Europe in 1241 were mostly built for other reasons: controlling peasants, defending against local rivals, projecting lordly power. But the Mongol invasion revealed their strategic value, and the response to that invasion accelerated their construction and systematized their use. What emerged was not a deliberate plan, but an emergent property of a fragmented political system where survival depended on local defense and no central authority could impose a unified strategy. And that system, unplanned and decentralized as it was, proved more resilient than the centralized empires the Mongols had defeated elsewhere, because even if one fortress fell, even if one region was devastated, the others remained. There was no single point of failure. The Mongols could not break European resistance by destroying a capital or killing a king. They would have to grind through every fortified position, one after another, across a landscape that grew more fortified every year. And they chose not to. By the mid-13th century, the strategic picture is clear. The Mongol tide has receded. Europe is fortified to an unprecedented degree. The military culture has shifted from valorizing the cavalry charge to understanding the importance of logistics, siegecraft, and endurance. And the lesson has been codified in stone across the continent. Control the fortifications, and you control the war. This lesson persists. Centuries later, when Napoleon campaigns across Europe, he too discovers that taking fortified cities consumes time and resources that can undermine even the most brilliant operational maneuvers. When the Germans invade Belgium in 1914, they bring siege howitzers specifically to reduce the fortresses around Liège and Namur, because they understand that those fortresses, if left intact, will disrupt the entire operational plan. Even in the 20th century, with railroads and mechanized armies and air power, fortifications still impose costs on attackers and shape strategic decisions. But the principle was established in the 13th century in the aftermath of the Mongol invasions, when Europe learned the hard way that survival depends not on winning battles, but on making conquest too expensive to sustain. There is a final dimension to this story that brings the strategic lesson into sharp focus, and it has to do with what happened after the Mongols withdrew. Because the fortified infrastructure of Europe did not just defend against external invasion, it reshaped internal conflict in ways that would define European political development for centuries. A king trying to centralize power found himself confronted by barons entrenched in stone castles who could resist royal authority for years. A rebellious city could withstand siege until political circumstances shifted or relief arrived. The same fortifications that denied the Mongols easy conquest also denied any single ruler the ability to impose unified control over fragmented territories. This created a paradox. The defensive system that saved Europe from conquest also locked Europe into a state of perpetual low-intensity conflict. Wars were frequent but rarely decisive. Territorial gains were slow and contested. Political unification, when it occurred, came through dynastic marriage, negotiation, or gradual absorption rather than rapid military conquest. France did not become a unified kingdom through a single campaign. It took centuries of slow consolidation as the French crown gradually reduced the power of independent nobles and absorbed their territories. England's conquest of Wales required decades, and the construction of Edward the. Whether that path was better or worse than the alternative is a question for historians and philosophers, but the strategic lesson is clear. Infrastructure matters. Time matters. The ability to impose costs on an attacker matters. A defender does not need to be stronger or faster or more skillful than the attacker. The defender needs to make victory cost more than the attacker is willing to pay. Europe in the 13th century learned this lesson in blood and fire, and the stone walls that rose in the aftermath of the Mongol invasion stand as monuments to that hard-won knowledge. The weapon medieval armies could not counter was the Mongol operational system. But the counter to that weapon was not a miracle or a hero. It was stone walls, provisioned garrisons, and the willingness to endure. It was a shift in the strategic framework that turned rapid conquest into grinding attrition, and it was enough. The decades following the Mongol withdrawal are not a time of peace, but they are a time of rebuilding. Hungary, devastated by the invasion, slowly recovers. King Bela IV earns the epithet Second Founder of the State for his efforts to repopulate the kingdom, invite new settlers, and most critically, fortify the realm. The network of castles he authorises becomes the backbone of Hungarian defence for the next century. When Mongol raids probe into the kingdom again in the 1280s, they encounter a very different strategic landscape. The fortresses hold, the raids inflict damage but do not achieve the catastrophic results of 1241. The lesson has been learned and implemented. Poland follows a similar trajectory. After the destruction of 1241, Polish princes rebuild their territories with an emphasis on stone fortifications. Cities like Krakow fortify their defences. Castles multiply across the kingdom. When the Mongols return in 1259 and again in 1287, the Poles are better prepared. The raids are still destructive. Villages burn, populations flee, but the core of the kingdom survives. The fortified centres hold, and once the Mongols withdraw, life resumes. The pattern established in Hungary repeats across the region. Fortifications do not make invasion impossible, but they make sustained conquest economically and militarily irrational. Across Europe, the memory of the Mongol invasions fades into legend, but the strategic infrastructure remains. Chroniclers write accounts that emphasize divine intervention and miraculous escapes. But beneath the religious framing, the practical lesson is embedded. Walls saved cities. Garrisons that held out survived. Those who fled into the open countryside perished. The next generation of military commanders absorbs this knowledge not from books but from the landscape itself. Every castle, every walled town, every fortified monastery is a physical reminder of what works. And the principle spreads beyond Europe. The Ottoman Empire, as it expands into the Balkans and Anatolia in the 14th and 15th centuries, invests heavily in siege technology, precisely because it understands that controlling fortified cities is the key to territorial dominance. The Ottomans do not make the Mongol mistake of relying solely on mobility and field battles. They build an entire military infrastructure around siege warfare, with specialised troops, massive cannon, and the logistical capacity to sustain long sieges. When they finally take Constantinople in 1453, it is the culmination of a siege that involves months of preparation, bombardment that cracks walls built to withstand anything the medieval world could throw at them, and a final assault that succeeds only because the defenders are outnumbered and exhausted. The Ottomans win because they adapted their military system to the fortified environment they were operating in. This is the contrast that reveals the lesson. The Mongols encountered fortified Europe and chose not to adapt. The Ottomans encountered the same challenge and built a military system specifically designed to overcome it. The difference is not courage or skill. Both empires had those in abundance. The difference is strategic choice and the willingness to transform operational methods to match the environment. The Mongols could have developed siege warfare capability. They had access to Chinese engineers who understood siegecraft at a level equal to or exceeding anything in Europe. But doing so would have required a fundamental shift in how their armies operated, a shift from mobility to static warfare, from rapid conquest to patient reduction of fortified positions. And that shift would have negated the very advantages that made the Mongol military system dominant in open terrain. The Ottomans made that shift because their strategic situation required it. They were expanding into regions thick with fortifications, and they could not achieve their goals without learning to take them. The Mongols faced no such requirement. They had vast territories to consolidate in Asia, conflicts with rival khanates, and strategic priorities that did not require holding Europe. So they withdrew, and Europe survived. But survival came at a cost. The fortified Europe that emerged from the 13th century was a Europe locked into patterns of conflict that would persist for centuries. The same walls that defended against external invasion also enabled internal fragmentation and endless local wars. The expense of building and maintaining fortifications drained resources that might have gone to other purposes. The strategic culture that valorized endurance and siegecraft produced long, grinding wars that exhausted populations and economies. The 100 Years' War, the Italian Wars, the 30 Years' War, all of these conflicts were shaped by the fortified landscape and the strategic logic it imposed. Was it worth it? That depends on your perspective. The alternative, this decentralized response, had consequences. Because there was no coordinating authority, the fortifications were not placed according to any grand strategic design. Some were redundant, clustered too closely together, others left gaps in coverage. Some were built on easily defensible high ground, Others sat on flat terrain where they could be more easily besieged. The quality varied enormously. Royal castles built with state resources were massive structures with multiple defensive layers, sophisticated gatehouses, and provisions for long sieges. Lesser fortifications were simpler: a stone tower, a curtain wall, minimal facilities. Some were built by skilled engineers who understood siege warfare. Others were constructed by local masons working from traditional designs that had not evolved to meet the new threat. But the sheer number of fortifications compensated for the unevenness in quality and placement. By the late 13th century, an invading army moving through Hungary or Poland would encounter a fortified position every 10 or 20 miles. Not all of them would be formidable. Many could be taken with a determined assault or a short siege, but each one consumed time. Each one required a decision: besiege it, bypass it, or ignore it, and those decisions added up. A mobile force that could cover 50 miles in a day in open steppe might manage 10 miles in fortified territory, with every river crossing contested, every town potentially hostile, every stretch of road overlooked by a castle on a hill. The Mongol operational model depended on speed of maneuver and the ability to concentrate force at decisive points before the enemy could react. That model worked brilliantly in regions where distances were vast and populations were concentrated in a few major centres. But in heavily fortified terrain, speed became difficult to sustain. Every fortified town that refused to open its gates was a potential threat to supply lines. Every bypassed castle was a base from which defenders could raid foraging parties or ambush messengers. The Mongols could still move faster than medieval European armies, but they could not move fast enough to avoid the friction imposed by fortifications. This friction is what changed the strategic calculus. In 1241, the Mongols swept through Hungary in a matter of weeks, destroying the field army and ravaging much of the kingdom before winter. In a hypothetical second invasion a generation later, against a fortified landscape, that same campaign would have taken months or years. The Mongols would still win most of the battles. They would still outmaneuver European forces in the field. But winning battles would no longer translate into territorial control, because control required reducing fortifications, and reducing fortifications required time that the Mongols could not afford to spend. The economics of siege warfare worked against mobile armies. A besieging force had to be larger than the garrison, sometimes significantly larger to maintain a blockade and protect against relief attempts. The besiegers had to bring supplies or forage locally, and foraging became harder the longer a siege lasted, as the surrounding countryside was stripped bare. Disease was a constant threat in siege camps, where large numbers of men and animals were concentrated in unsanitary conditions. Morale eroded as weeks turned into months with no resolution. And all the while, the strategic clock was running. Every day spent besieging one fortress was a day the enemy had to reinforce others, to gather relief forces, to shift political alliances. For the Mongols, operating at the end of a supply line that stretched back to the steppes, these costs were magnified. They could not easily replace losses. They could not summon reinforcements from nearby garrisons because there were no nearby garrisons. They could not resupply from friendly territory because there was no friendly territory. Everything they needed had to be carried with them or taken from the land they were invading. And the longer they stayed in one place, besieging a fortress that might or might not surrender, the more vulnerable they became to the very attrition they usually inflicted on their enemies. Subutai understood this. His withdrawal from Hungary in 1242 was framed as obedience to the summons back to Karakorum for the Kurultai, and that was certainly a factor. But the strategic situation was already deteriorating. The fortresses were holding. The countryside was devastated but not pacified. Winter was ending, and with spring would come the need to either consolidate control or withdraw. Consolidation meant reducing the fortifications one by one, a campaign that could take years and would tie down the entire Mongol force in static war. The strategic impact of fortifications extended beyond their direct military function. A fortified city was not just a defensive position, it was an economic and political centre that could continue to function even in wartime. Markets operated behind walls. Artisans produced goods. Administrators collected taxes and maintained records. Refugees from the surrounding countryside brought labour and information. A city that could hold out during an invasion preserved not just lives, but the institutional and economic infrastructure necessary for recovery once the threat passed. This gave fortified cities a resilience that open settlements lacked. When the Mongols burned a village, it ceased to exist. When they besieged a walled city and failed to take it, the city emerged intact, and the surrounding region could rebuild using the city as a base. This resilience had profound long-term effects. Regions with strong fortified cities recovered faster from invasions and raids. They maintained continuity of governance and economic activity. They attracted population because people sought safety behind walls. Over time, this created a positive feedback loop. Cities that invested in fortifications became wealthier because they attracted residents and trade. Wealthier cities could afford stronger fortifications and larger garrisons. Stronger fortifications attracted more residents and trade. The cycle reinforced itself, and by the 14th century, the wealthiest and most powerful cities in Europe were almost universally those with the strongest walls. This dynamic reshaped the political landscape. In Italy, walled cities like Venice, Florence, and Genoa became independent powers that could negotiate with kings and emperors as near equals. In Germany, free cities within the Holy Roman Empire used their fortifications to maintain autonomy from both imperial authority and local nobles. In the Low Countries, cities like Bruges and Ghent leveraged their walls and wealth to extract privileges from their nominal overlords. The ability to defend themselves militarily gave urban populations political leverage they would not otherwise have had. A king could command a city to pay taxes or provide troops, but if the city refused and closed its gates, the king faced a lengthy and expensive siege with no guarantee of success. This is a crucial point that often gets overlooked in discussions of medieval warfare. Fortifications did not just defend against external enemies, they empowered those who controlled them to resist internal coercion as well. A fortified city could defy a king. A fortified castle could shelter rebels. Fortifications distributed military power across the landscape in a way that made centralized control difficult. This frustrated rulers who wanted to consolidate authority, but it also created space for alternative forms of political organization. The rise of republican city-states in Italy, the persistence of autonomous free cities in Germany, the development of representative institutions in the Low Countries, all of these were enabled in part by the fact that walled cities could defend themselves and therefore had to be negotiated with rather than simply commanded. The Mongols never had to deal with this kind of political fragmentation in their own empire. The Mongol administrative system was hierarchical and centralized. Local rulers who submitted were incorporated into the system and required to pay tribute and provide troops. Those who resisted were destroyed. The system worked because the Mongol military could enforce it. A city that refused to submit could be besieged and taken, its population killed or enslaved as an example to others. The speed and efficiency of Mongol siege warfare in Asia ensured that resistance was usually brief. Cities surrendered rather than face annihilation, but in Europe the fortifications and the political fragmentation reinforced each other. A city could resist because it had strong walls. It was willing to resist because there was no central authority that could negotiate on its behalf or compel surrender. Each city, each castle, each fortified town made its own decision about whether to fight or submit, and because there were hundreds of them, spread across the landscape, the Mongols could not make examples of a few to terrorize the rest. They would have to fight each one individually, a grinding campaign of attrition that would consume years and cost thousands of lives. The strategic lesson here is that political structure matters as much as military capability. A centralized state can be conquered by destroying its capital and capturing or killing its leadership. A fragmented political landscape with distributed defensive infrastructure cannot be conquered the same way. There is no center to strike. Every fragment must be dealt with separately. The Mongols excelled at they struggled with fragmented ones, especially when those fragments were fortified. Europe in the 13th century was the most fragmented and fortified region the Mongols encountered. It was also the only major theatre where they chose not to press their conquest to completion. This was not an accident. It was gatehouses became elaborate structures with multiple portcullises, murder holes in the ceiling for pouring boiling water or oil, and right-angle turns that forced attackers to expose their unshielded side to defenders. Water defences, moats, flooded ditches, artificial lakes, surrounded castles where terrain permitted, making it impossible to bring siege towers or rams directly to the walls. These innovations were tested constantly in the wars that racked Europe through the 14th and 15th centuries. The Hundred Years' War provided a prolonged laboratory for siege warfare. English forces under Edward III and later Henry V took French fortifications through a combination of bombardment, mining, blockade, and assault. The French learned from their losses and improved their defences. Walls were thickened to resist artillery. Bastions were added to provide flanking fire against besiegers. Supply systems were refined to allow cities to hold out for months. The defence of Orléans in 1429, where Joan of Arc helped break an English siege, demonstrated that even a prolonged blockade could be defeated if relief forces could break through and resupply the garrison. The Italian wars of the late 15th and early 16th centuries pushed fortification design even further. The French invasion of Italy in 1494 brought powerful siege artillery that could batter down medieval walls in days. The Italian city-states responded by developing the Tres Italienne, low, thick walls fronted by earth ramparts to absorb cannon fire, angled bastions that eliminated dead zones and provided overlapping fields of fire, and deep ditches to keep siege guns at a distance. These new fortifications were enormously expensive, requiring years to build and constant maintenance, but they worked. A properly designed Tres Italian fort could hold off an army for months, even under sustained artillery bombardment. This arms race between fortification and siege technology had broader implications beyond the immediate military context. The expense of building and maintaining modern fortifications meant that only wealthy states and cities could afford them. Smaller lordships and rural castles became obsolete as military positions, their walls too thin to resist cannon, and their garrisons too small to man the extensive perimeters of modern fortifications. Power concentrated in the hands of those who could afford to fortify on the new model: major cities, territorial princes, and monarchs with access to substantial tax revenues. The military transformation drove political centralization, as smaller independent powers either submitted to larger ones or were conquered because they could not defend themselves. But the larger strategic lesson remained constant across these technological and political changes. Fortifications imposed costs on attackers and bought time for defenders. The specific design of the fortifications evolved as siege technology advanced, but the principle endured. A fortified position had to be reduced or bypassed, and either choice carried risks and consumed resources. This remained true whether the walls were medieval stone or early modern Tres Italienne, whether the siege weapons were trebuchets or cannon, whether the garrison numbered in the dozens or thousands. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century had revealed this principle to Europe in the starkest possible terms. The most mobile and tactically superior army in the world had been unable to translate battlefield dominance into territorial conquest, because the fortified infrastructure imposed costs that the Mongols chose not to pay. Everything that followed, the proliferation of castles in the late 13th century, the evolution of siege warfare through the late medieval period, the development of artillery fortifications in the Renaissance, built on that foundational lesson. Fortifications worked, not perfectly, not without cost, but well enough to make conquest expensive and territorial control difficult, and the lesson spread beyond Europe. When the Ottomans developed their sophisticated siege capabilities in the 15th century, they did so because they understood that controlling the Balkans and Anatolia required taking fortified cities. When the Spanish built fortifications across their empire in the Americas, they applied principles learned from centuries of European warfare. When the British fortified their colonial possessions, they drew on a military tradition that traced back through early modern Europe to the medieval fortifications that had defended against everything from Viking raids to Mongol invasions. The knowledge became embedded in Western military thought, passed down through military manuals, engineering treatises, and the practical experience of commanders who had besieged or defended fortified positions. But there is another dimension to the story that reveals the true depth of the strategic transformation. The fortifications that spread across Europe after 1241 did not just defend territory. They changed how societies organized themselves for war. A fortified city required a garrison, and that garrison required pay, food, weapons, and discipline. Maintaining a garrison year-round meant developing administrative systems to manage recruitment, supply, and payment. It meant establishing granaries and arsenals within the walls. It meant training programs for crossbowmen, engineers, and artillerymen. All of this required record-keeping, taxation, and bureaucratic infrastructure. The city-states of Italy provide the clearest example of this transformation. Venice maintained detailed records of its fortifications, garrison strengths, artillery pieces, and supply stocks. The city employed permanent military engineers and artillery masters. It established training programs for gunners and fortification specialists. It built arsenals that could produce weapons and ammunition on an industrial scale. All of this administrative and logistical infrastructure was necessary to defend the city and its empire of fortified ports and islands across the Mediterranean. And that infrastructure, in turn, provided the organizational capacity for Venice to project power far beyond its immediate territory. The Mongols had nothing comparable. Their administrative system was sophisticated in its own way, designed to extract tribute from conquered populations and mobilize forces for campaigns, but it was not designed to maintain permanent garrisons in hundreds of fortified positions across a landscape. It was designed for mobility and conquest, not for static defense and occupation. Adapting it to the European strategic environment would have required building an entirely new administrative apparatus, one that could manage supply lines to besieging forces, coordinate rotations of garrison troops, maintain siege equipment, and sustain operations for months or years at a time. The Mongols had done this in China, where the conquest required decades of sustained effort, including lengthy sieges of major cities. But China was adjacent to Mongolia, accessible via relatively short supply lines, and represented a prize wealthy enough to justify the effort. Europe in the 13th century was distant, already devastated by the initial invasion, and politically fragmented in ways that made consolidation difficult. The final piece of the puzzle lies in understanding what made the European defensive transformation sustainable over the long term. Building fortifications was one thing. Maintaining them, garrisoning them, and keeping them ready for war across generations was another. Many defensive systems in history have been built in response to immediate threats and then allowed to decay once the threat receded. Hadrian's Wall in Britain fell into disrepair after Roman legions withdrew. The Great Wall of China required constant maintenance and substantial garrisons to remain effective, and when dynastic authority weakened, sections were abandoned. What made Europe different was that the fortifications became embedded in the social and economic fabric in ways that ensured their continued maintenance even after the immediate Mongol threat disappeared. The key was that fortifications served multiple purposes beyond pure military defense. A castle was a residence for a noble family, a center of local administration, a symbol of authority, and a source of revenue through the control of surrounding lands. A walled city was a market center, a refuge for artisans and merchants, a base for regional trade, and a source of tax revenue for whoever held it. These multiple functions meant that maintaining fortifications was not just a military expense, but an investment that paid returns in political control, economic activity, and social prestige. A lord who let his castle fall into ruin lost not just military capability, but political authority and economic income. A city that allowed its walls to crumble lost population to better defended rivals. This created a self-sustaining system. Fortifications were maintained because they were useful, and they remained useful because the political and economic environment continued to reward those who controlled them. Wars remained frequent enough that military considerations stayed relevant. Even in peacetime, fortified positions provided security that encouraged economic activity and population concentration. The result was that Europe remained heavily fortified for centuries, long after the Mongol threat had faded into. This stands in sharp contrast to how other societies responded to nomadic invasions. China built walls, but wall maintenance depended on centralized state capacity, and when dynasties weakened, the walls weakened with them. The consequences of this choice rippled through the subsequent centuries. Europe developed along its own trajectory, politically fragmented and militarily competitive, rather than being incorporated into a Mongol or successor empire. The fortification imperative shaped European political development, encouraging the growth of autonomous cities and preventing the emergence of unified empires until much later. The military traditions that emerged from centuries of siege warfare influenced European colonial expansion, as European powers brought their expertise in fortification and siegecraft to conflicts around the world. The administrative and logistical systems developed to maintain fortifications and garrisons laid groundwork for the bureaucratic states of early modern Europe. All of this traced back, in part, to the trauma of 1241 and the strategic lesson it taught. The weapon that medieval armies could not counter was the Mongol operational system. mobility, coordination, intelligence, and the ability to destroy field armies before they could concentrate. But the counter to that weapon was not another weapon. It was infrastructure. Stone walls, provisioned garrisons, and a strategic culture that understood how to use them. It was the willingness to endure sieges, to hold out behind walls while the countryside burned, to deny the enemy rapid victory and force them into a war of attrition they could not afford to fight. The Mongols withdrew in 1242, and they never returned in force. Europe fortified, adapted, and survived. Not through genius or heroism, though there were individual acts of both. Not through divine intervention, though contemporaries certainly believed God had delivered them. But through the simple, grinding logic of fortifications, logistics, and time. The lesson was learned in blood and stone, and it shaped the course of European history for centuries to come. The weapon medieval armies could not counter met the response they could not overcome. Stone walls held, garrisons endured, and Europe, devastated but not conquered, rebuilt itself behind fortifications that turned the most formidable military force in the world away from its gates. That is the grounded strategic lesson, proven not in a single battle but across decades of warfare, adaptation and survival. Infrastructure matters, time matters, endurance matters, and sometimes the unglamorous work of building walls and provisioning garrisons determines the fate of civilizations more surely than the most brilliant cavalry charge or the most decisive battlefield victory ever could.